The glass walls of the conference room on the 42nd floor were spotless, offering a sweeping view of the city skyline below. It was the kind of view that reminded people how small they really were in the grand scheme of things. Simone stood by the head of the long, polished table, arranging her papers with deliberate care. She took a slow, deep breath, smoothing down the front of her navy blue blazer. It was a gesture she did to ground herself, a way to remind her body that she belonged in this room, even if her heart was beating a little faster than usual. At 28 years old, Simone was used to being the odd one out. She had spent her entire college career studying while others partied, and her early 20s working late nights while her friends were out celebrating birthdays and weddings. She had clawed her way up from nothing, relying on grit, intelligence, and an unshakable belief that hard work would eventually speak for itself. Today, however, felt different. The air in the room was thick, not with humidity, but with an unspoken tension that seemed to settle on the shoulders of everyone present. Around the table sat the board members of the company. Most of them were men in their 50s and 60s, wearing suits that cost more than Simone's first car. They shuffled their papers, checked their phones, and sipped on sparkling water, their eyes occasionally darting toward the empty hallway outside. They were waiting for the main event. They were waiting for him. Richard Sterling was a name that commanded respect, fear, and awe in equal measure. He was a billionaire investor, a man who had built an empire from the ground up by making ruthless decisions and crushing anyone who stood in his way. His net worth was staggering, but his ego was even larger. Rumors swirled around him, stories of him firing executives on the spot, of him reducing grown men to tears in boardrooms just like this one. He was a titan of industry, and today he was coming to discuss a potential merger that could change the future of Simone's company. Simone checked the time on the small clock on the wall. It was 2 minutes past the hour. The meeting was supposed to start already, but no one dared to begin without Richard. It was understood that the world revolved around his schedule, not the other way around. She looked at the faces of the board members. They were nervous. Some tapped their pens rhythmically against the glass tabletop, a nervous tick that echoed softly in the quiet room. Others stared blankly at the view, lost in their own thoughts. Suddenly, a commotion in the hallway broke the silence. The sound of confident, heavy footsteps approached. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The nervous energy turned into a kind of electric anticipation. The door to the conference room slid open smoothly and silently, and Richard Sterling walked in. He was taller than Simone had expected. He wore a charcoal gray suit that fit him perfectly, and his silver hair was combed back neatly. He didn't walk, he strode. He carried an aura of absolute authority, like a king entering his court. He didn't look at the people seated at the table. He didn't offer a greeting or a nod of acknowledgement. He simply walked to the single high-backed leather chair at the far end of the room, the one that was clearly reserved for him. As he moved past Simone, she straightened her spine. She offered a polite, professional smile, ready to extend her hand and introduce herself. This was her moment to make a first impression, to show him that she was ready to lead. "Good morning, Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice clear and projecting well across the room. "It is an honor to finally meet you." Richard stopped walking, but he didn't turn to face her. He paused, checking his expensive wristwatch, his brow furrowing slightly as if he had just noticed a smudge on the glass. He let out a short, dry sigh that seemed to dismiss her presence entirely. He then turned his head just enough to look at her over his shoulder. His eyes were cold, calculating, and utterly unimpressed. "Is the coffee not ready?" he asked, his voice deep and gravelly. He didn't address her by name. He didn't even look her in the eye. He looked past her, scanning the room for a server or an assistant. Simone felt a flush of heat rise to her cheeks, but she kept her smile fixed in place. She had faced assumptions before. She knew what it looked like when someone saw her skin color and her youth, and immediately categorized her as the help. It was a painful, familiar sting, one that she had learned to swallow over the years, but it never got easier. "I believe there is coffee on the side table, Mr. Sterling," she replied calmly, keeping her tone professional. "But if you are ready, I was hoping to begin the presentation. We have a lot of ground to cover." Richard let out a low, humorless chuckle. He finally turned to face her fully, his hands resting casually in his pockets. He looked her up and down, his gaze lingering on her blazer and then on the folder in her hands. Presentation, he repeated, raising an eyebrow. And who exactly are you presenting? The quarterly reports. I was told the CEO would be presenting today. I don't have time for junior staff to practice their public speaking. The room went deadly silent. The tapping of pens stopped. The shuffling of papers ceased. Every pair of eyes in the room darted between the powerful billionaire and the young woman standing by the table. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Simone felt the weight of everyone's stares. She felt the pity from some and the embarrassment from others. She gripped her folder a little tighter. This was the barrier she faced every single day. It didn't matter that she had graduated top of her class. It didn't matter that she had revolutionized the company's digital infrastructure in her first 6 months. To him, she was just a young black woman in a room full of older white men, and in his mind that equation didn't equal boss. "I am the CEO, Mr. Sterling," Simone said. Her voice wavered for just a fraction of a second, but she steadied it. "I'm Simone Carter. We spoke via email last month." Richard stared at her for a long moment. Then he threw his head back and laughed. It wasn't a joyful laugh. It was a mocking sound that bounced off the glass walls. He shook his head, looking at the board members with a smirk on his face, as if sharing a private joke. "Is this a joke?" he asked the room at large, ignoring Simone completely. "You hired a child to run the show? No, this is absurd." He turned back to Simone, his expression hardening. He stepped closer to her, using his height to try and intimidate her. "Look, girl," he said, his voice dropping to a condescending whisper that the whole room could still hear. "I don't know who you think you are or whose badge you borrowed, but I am here to do business. Real business. $1 million business, not play pretend. Now go find the person in charge before I walk out that door and take my investment with me." Simone felt her heart hammering against her ribs. The insult was sharp, meant to cut deep and make her feel small. He was calling her a liar. He was stripping away her title, her education, and her hard work with a few careless sentences. She wanted to shrink back. She wanted to apologize and step aside just to make the awkwardness go away. That was the path of least resistance, the way she had handled these situations in the past. But then she remembered the late nights. She remembered the sacrifices her mother had made so she could go to a good school. She remembered the employees who relied on her leadership, the families who put food on the table because of the jobs she had created. She wasn't a child playing pretend. She was the reason this company was still standing. She took a breath and lifted her chin. She didn't look away from Richard Sterling's cold gaze. She stood her ground, her heels planted firmly on the plush carpet. The silence in the room stretched on, heavy and suffocating, waiting to see what would happen next. The board members looked terrified, seemingly frozen in their seats. The billionaire stood with his arms crossed, waiting for her to retreat, fully expecting her to crumble under his stare. Simone didn't crumble. She simply waited, her eyes locked on his, projecting a calmness she didn't entirely feel. She knew something he didn't. She knew the truth of who she was, and she knew that the papers in her folder didn't lie. The air in the room felt like a stretched rubber band, pulled tight and ready to snap. The silence that followed Richard Sterling's words was thick and suffocating. It wasn't just a pause in conversation, it was a complete standstill of time. Simone stood frozen near the head of the table, her hands still clutching her folder. She felt the heat in her cheeks, a burning sensation that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. It was the heat of humiliation, sharp and stinging, but beneath that, something else was beginning to smolder. It was a quiet, steady resolve. Richard didn't wait for a response. He seemed to feed on the discomfort in the room. He turned his back on her, effectively dismissing her existence, and pulled out the leather chair at the head of the table. He sat down with a heavy sigh, arranging his tailored jacket and looking expectantly at the other board members. He tapped his finger on the glass tabletop, a rhythmic, impatient sound that seemed to echo like a ticking clock. "Well?" Richard asked, his voice booming slightly in the quiet room. He looked at the man sitting to his right, an older gentleman with kind eyes who had been with the company for decades. "I assume the real leadership is running late. Traffic, perhaps. Or is this some sort of new age sensitivity training I wasn't informed about? I don't have all day for games." The older man shifted in his seat. He looked uncomfortable. his eyes darting nervously from Richard to Simone and back again. He opened his mouth as if to speak, to perhaps correct the billionaire, but the words seemed to catch in his throat. The power dynamic in the room was overwhelmingly tilted in Richard's favor. He was the money, he was the power, and in the world of high-stakes business, money often spoke louder than the truth. Simone watched the exchange. She saw the fear in the board members' eyes. They were terrified of offending Richard, of losing the funding that kept the company afloat. They were willing to let this mistake slide, to let her stand there and be diminished just to keep the peace. It was a familiar feeling. It was the feeling of being invisible, of being seen but not heard, of being valued only as a prop in someone else's story. But she wasn't a prop. She was the author of this company's recent success. She took a slow, deliberate step forward. The sound of her heel on the carpet was soft, but in the silence it sounded like a statement. She didn't look at the board members. She didn't look at the floor. She locked her eyes directly onto the back of Richard Sterling's head. "Mr. Sterling," she said. Her voice came out stronger than she expected. It didn't waver. It didn't crack. It was calm, cool, and smooth like ice. Richard stopped tapping his finger. He didn't turn around immediately. He sat there for a moment, perhaps surprised that the assistant hadn't scurried away yet. Slowly, he swiveled his chair to face her. His expression was one of annoyance, like a man who had been interrupted by a fly buzzing around his ear. "I thought I made myself clear," Richard said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming dangerous and low. "I don't speak to the help about corporate strategy. It's nothing personal. It's just the way the world works. Now please go get your boss or fetch me a coffee. Whichever is faster." A few nervous chuckles rippled through the table from a couple of the younger executives, a reflex reaction to the power play. It made Simone's stomach turn. They were laughing at her expense, or worse, laughing out of fear. She ignored them. She took another breath, filling her lungs with the cool, conditioned air of the office. She thought about her grandmother, who had cleaned houses for 40 years so her children could have a chance. She thought about the countless nights she had spent studying in the library while others were sleeping. She thought about the design plans in her hands, plans that would revolutionize their industry and save thousands of jobs. "I am not the help, Mr. Sterling," Simone said. She placed her folder on the table and slid it toward him. It made a soft, swooshing sound against the polished glass. "And I am not playing pretend. My name is Simone Carter. I am the chief executive officer of this company. I was appointed by the board 8 months ago after the previous CEO stepped down." Richard stared at the folder. He didn't open it. He stared at it as if it were a foreign object, something alien and confusing. Then a smirk crept back onto his face. It was a look of pure condescension. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, looking up at her with mock interest. "Appointed," he repeated, letting the word hang in the air. "That's a nice fairy tale, let me guess. Diversity hire, a quota to fill. It's fashionable these days to have a young face at the top, isn't it? But let's be honest, little girl, you don't have the experience, you don't have the look. You walk into a room and people don't see a CEO, they see a mistake." He stood up then, rising to his full height. He tried to use his physical presence to bully her, to make her step back. He straightened his tie, looking down his nose at her. "I've built skyscrapers," Richard said, his voice low and intense. "I've bought and sold companies twice the size of this one before you were even born. I know what a leader looks like. And frankly, you don't measure up. You're out of your depth. This charade ends now. I'm calling for a vote of no confidence right here, right now. I want someone competent in this chair by the end of the day." He turned to the board members, sweeping his arm out to encompass them all. "Who agrees with me?" Richard shouted, his voice filling the room. "Who is ready to stop this joke and get back to real business? Raise your hands." Simone felt her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. This was it. This was the moment where everything could fall apart. If the board caved, if they raised their hands out of fear, her career was over. The company she had worked so hard to save would be dismantled and sold for parts. She looked around the table. She saw the sweat on the forehead of the CFO. She saw the trembling hands of the marketing director. But she also saw something else. She saw the man in the gray suit, the chairman of the board, slowly lean forward. He wasn't looking at Richard. He was looking at Simone. There was no pity in his eyes now. There was a strange, quiet intensity. Richard stood with his hand raised, waiting for the others to join him. He expected immediate compliance. He expected the world to bend to his will as it always had. He was a billionaire. He was a king in his own mind, but seconds ticked by, 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. The room remained still. No hands went up, no voices joined his. The silence was deafening. It wasn't the silence of fear anymore, it was the silence of shock and perhaps the silence of dignity. Richard's smile began to falter. He looked around the table, his eyes narrowing. "Well," he barked, though his voice seemed to have lost some of its bite. "What are you waiting for?" "I am offering you a way out of this embarrassment." Simone didn't move. She stood tall, her chin lifted. She felt a sudden rush of adrenaline. She wasn't going to let him win, not today. Not in her house. She reached out and opened the folder she had placed on the table. Inside was a photograph of her shaking hands with the mayor, and beneath it, the official shareholder document that gave her the majority voting power, a fact Richard had obviously missed in his arrogance. She flipped the document around so he could read it clearly. "I think you should take a look at the signatures at the bottom, Richard," Simone said, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "And then I think you should sit down, because we have a meeting to run and you are currently wasting my time." The atmosphere in the room shifted. It was subtle, like the change in air pressure before a storm. The power was moving. It was sliding away from the billionaire and drifting toward the young woman who refused to back down. Richard looked down at the paper. He scanned the names. His face went pale. The board members shifted, their eyes moving from the paper to the billionaire, watching his reaction carefully. The game had changed, and everyone in the room could feel it. Richard Sterling stood frozen, his eyes locked on the document that lay on the glass table between them. It was as if the paper had physically struck him. The arrogance that had inflated his posture just moments ago began to leak out, leaving him looking slightly smaller than he had when he walked in. The silence in the room was no longer just awkward, it was heavy with the crushing weight of realization. He had made a mistake, a massive, public, and humiliating mistake. He blinked rapidly, his mind scrambling to find a way out. He was a man who had built a career on never being wrong, on bending reality to his will with the sheer force of his money. He looked up from the shareholder agreement, his eyes darting toward the man sitting at the center of the long table. It was Mr. Thompson, the chairman of the board. Thompson was a man in his 70s, with silver hair and a face mapped with decades of hard decisions. He had been silent throughout the entire exchange, watching with a hawk-like intensity that was unsettling. Richard cleared his throat. He tried to summon the smooth, commanding tone he used in boardrooms across the world, but this time it sounded hollow. This is highly irregular," he stammered, pointing a shaking finger at the paper. "There must be some confusion. My legal team reviewed the dossier on this company last week." "They didn't mention," he trailed off, realizing that blaming his staff would only make him look weaker. Mr. Thompson slowly removed his reading glasses and placed them on the table in front of him. The soft click of the frames against the wood was the only sound in the room. He didn't look at Richard. Instead, he turned his head to look at Simone. His gaze was steady, filled with a quiet, profound respect that hadn't been there before. He saw her standing tall, her chin lifted, refusing to shrink under the weight of the billionaire's insult. "Mr. Sterling," Mr. Thompson said. His voice was not loud, but it carried the weight of authority. It was the voice of a man who didn't need to shout to be heard. "There is no confusion. Your legal team likely ignored the recent proxy filings because they assumed, as you did, that a young woman of color could not possibly hold the majority voting power. That was their first error. And yours was believing that money buys you the right to humiliate a stranger." Richard's face turned a dark shade of crimson. The blood rushed to his cheeks, a mix of anger and profound embarrassment. He looked around the table, desperate for an ally, a smirk, anything that would indicate he wasn't alone in his thinking. But the atmosphere had shifted. The other board members, who had been cowering in their seats moments ago, now sat a little straighter. They were watching the chairman, taking their cues from him. I was merely questioning the credentials," Richard tried to explain, his voice growing defensive. "This is a billion-dollar merger we are discussing. We can't afford to have someone inexperienced at the helm. I was protecting my investment." Protecting your investment, Mr. Thompson repeated, raising a bushy gray eyebrow. Is that what you call publicly mocking a CEO before she has spoken a single word about business? You didn't question her credentials, Richard. You questioned her existence. You saw a young black woman and you assumed she was serving you. That wasn't business. That was a bias. Simone felt a wave of relief wash over her, warm and soothing. It wasn't just about being defended. It was about being seen. Mr. Thompson wasn't just saving her from an awkward moment. He was acknowledging the truth of what she had endured. He was naming the thing that everyone in the room knew had happened, but was too afraid to say. The chief financial officer, a man named David who usually kept his head down and focused on spreadsheets, suddenly spoke up. He was sitting to Richard's left, and his voice was trembling slightly, but he spoke nonetheless. "Mr. Sterling," David said, I mean Ms. Carter has increased our Q3 profits by 40%. She did that in 6 months. The previous CEO didn't manage that in 5 years. She knows more about this company's trajectory than anyone in this building." Another board member, a woman named Patricia who ran the logistics department, nodded in agreement. She leaned forward, placing her elbows on the table. "She also saved the pension fund," Patricia added, her voice gaining strength. "When the market crashed last year, she made the tough calls that saved hundreds of jobs. We didn't need a savior from the outside, Mr. Sterling. We already had one right here." The room began to shift. It was like watching a dam break, slowly at first, then all at once. The fear that Richard Sterling had cast over the room evaporated, replaced by a collective solidarity. These were people who had worked with Simone. They had seen her late nights. They had seen her brilliance, and now, faced with the absurdity of Richard's prejudice, they found their courage. Richard looked from face to face, his mouth slightly open. He was used to people nodding when he spoke. He was used to boardrooms bending to his will. But here, in this glass-walled room high above the city, he was on an island. He was a billionaire used to being the center of the universe. But suddenly, he realized he was just a man who had made a fool of himself. He looked back at Simone. For the first time since he walked in, he really looked at her. He looked past the youthful skin, past the blazer, past the color of her skin. He saw the steel in her spine. He saw the intelligence in her eyes. He saw the woman who held the pen over his investment. Richard started, but the words died in his throat. He adjusted his expensive tie, the gesture nervous and jerky. He had no cards left to play. The room had silenced him. They had stripped away his power with nothing but the truth. He sat down slowly, the leather chair creaking under his weight, and for the first time in decades, he didn't know what to say. Mr. Thompson turned his attention fully to Simone. He gestured with an open hand toward the head of the table, the spot Richard had tried to claim as his own. "Ms. Carter," the chairman said, his voice gentle but commanding, "please. Continue your presentation. We are listening." Simone nodded, a small, tight smile touching her lips. She didn't look at Richard. She didn't need to. She had won not by fighting dirty, but by standing her ground. She picked up the remote for the projector and clicked it. The screen behind her flickered to life, displaying the charts and graphs that proved her worth. The hum of the projector filled the silence, and the meeting finally, truly began. The projector hummed softly in the quiet room, casting a bright square of light onto the white wall behind Simone. She held the small remote in her hand, her fingers steady. The trembling she had felt earlier was gone, replaced by a calm focus. She looked out at the sea of faces. The fear that had gripped the room just moments ago had evaporated. In its place was a rapt, attentive silence. Everyone, even the administrative assistant standing by the side table with a pitcher of water, was leaning forward. Simone clicked a button. The slide changed. It wasn't a chart showing profit margins or stock trends. It was a photograph. It showed a community center in a rundown part of the city. The paint was peeling, but the playground was full of children. In the corner of the image, a small plaque read, "Funded by the Carter Initiative." "This," Simone said, her voice clear and resonant, "is where I grew up." She didn't say it to garner sympathy. She didn't say it to make a point about her struggle. She said it simply as a fact, a foundation for what was to come. She looked directly at Richard Sterling as she spoke. He was sitting in the chair he had tried to commandeer, his hands folded tightly in his lap. He wasn't looking at the screen. He was looking at the table, his jaw tight. I show you this not to tell you a sad story, Simone continued, walking slowly to the side of the screen so she could address the whole room. I show you this because this building represents the core of our business model. You see a community center. I see a market. I see future employees. I see families who need the services we provide. She clicked the remote again. The slide shifted to a graph. It was a sharp upward curve. When we invested in this neighborhood, we didn't just write a check. We built relationships. We hired locally. We trained people who had been ignored by every other corporation in this city. And in return, we gained a loyal workforce that stays. Our turnover rate is 4%, Mr. Sterling. The industry average is 25. The CFO, David, nodded enthusiastically from his seat. He tapped his pen on his own copy of the report, validating her numbers. She's right, he chimed in, his voice gaining strength now that he knew he wasn't alone. The retention numbers are historic. It saved us millions in training costs. Simone gave David a small, appreciative nod. She was doing exactly what she had trained herself to do, turning the focus away from the drama and back to the business. But she knew that the business wasn't just numbers on a page. It was people. She walked toward the table where Richard sat. She didn't stop until she was standing right next to him. She placed a hand on the back of the empty chair next to him, not touching him, but close enough that he had to look up. You asked about my credentials earlier, Simone said, her tone polite but unyielding. You assumed I was here because of a quota. The truth is, I am here because I see value where you see nothing. She reached into her folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper. She slid it across the glass surface toward him. It was an organizational chart, but it wasn't the standard corporate ladder. It was a web. It showed the interconnectedness of their suppliers, their employees, and their customers. You built your empire by cutting costs, Simone said softly. You buy companies, you strip the parts that don't make immediate profit, and you sell the rest. That is one way to do business. But it is not our way. Richard stared at the paper. His eyes scanned the names and the connections. He saw the numbers, he saw the projections. He was a man who understood numbers better than he understood people. And for the first time, the numbers were telling him a story he hadn't anticipated. The logic was undeniable. The profit margins were higher than his own analysts had predicted. Richard started, his voice rough. He cleared his throat. He looked up at Simone, and for a fleeting second the mask of arrogance slipped. Beneath it, he looked tired. He looked like a man who had been fighting wars for so long he had forgotten what peace looked like. I hadn't realized the local engagement strategy was so lucrative. It is, Simone said. Because loyalty pays. People work harder for you when they know you care about their survival, not just their output. Patricia, the logistics head, spoke up from the other end of the table. We've also secured government grants for the sustainability projects because of the community outreach. That's capital we don't have to pay back, Mr. Sterling. It's free money because of the work Simone has done. Richard sat back in his chair. The realization was settling on him heavily. He hadn't just insulted a CEO, he had misread an entire company. He had walked in thinking he was the shark coming to feed on a small fish. He was realizing now that he was in a tank with a whale. Simone clicked the remote one last time. The screen went black. The presentation was over. We don't need your money to survive, Mr. Sterling, Simone said, returning to the head of the table. She stood there, commanding the space with her presence. We are already profitable. We are already growing. We invited you here because we thought your resources could accelerate our mission. We thought you shared our vision for the future. She paused, letting the words hang in the air. But if you cannot respect the leadership that built this success, she continued, looking around the room at the board members who had stood by her, then perhaps your money would be better suited elsewhere. The silence returned. But this time it was different. It wasn't the silence of fear. It was the silence of anticipation. It was the silence of a room waiting for a king to bow. Richard Sterling looked at the blank screen. He looked at the paper on the table. He looked at the young woman who had stood her ground against him. He had spent 40 years intimidating people. He had spent 40 years being the loudest voice in the room. He knew he could fight this. He could try to buy the board, or he could leverage his other holdings to hurt them. But as he looked at Simone, he realized something profound. He was tired. He was tired of the fighting, and for the first time he saw a kind of strength he didn't possess. He possessed the strength of the wallet. She possessed the strength of the spirit. And in this room on this day, her strength was winning. He slowly picked up the pen that lay on the table in front of him. He clicked it open. The sound echoed in the quiet room. He looked up at Mr. Thompson, the chairman. "You have the floor, Ms. Carter," Richard said, his voice low and stripped of its earlier bite. "Tell me what you need." It wasn't a grand apology. It wasn't a surrender, but it was an admission. It was the sound of a wall crumbling. Simone allowed herself a small, internal sigh of relief. She had done it. She had turned the ship around. But she knew the meeting wasn't over. Now the real work began. Now she had to prove that her vision was worth every penny of his billions. "Thank you, Mr. Sterling," she said. "Let's talk about the future."